Egyptian Magic by Ernest Alfred Thompson Wallis Budge. Preface. An examination of the surviving native religious literature of ancient Egypt which has been transmitted to us has revealed the fact that the belief in magic, that is to say, in the efficacy of magical names and spells and enchantments and formulae and pictures and figures and amulets, and in the execution of ceremonies accompanied by the articulation of words of power, to manifest supernatural results, constituted a substantial and integral component of the Egyptian religion. Furthermore, it is indisputable that, notwithstanding the continuous progress which the Egyptians achieved in civilization, and the profound intellectual development to which they ultimately attained, this conviction profoundly influenced their minds and, from the earliest to the latest epochs of their history, shaped their perspectives regarding matters temporal as well as spiritual in a manner which, at this present stage in human history, is exceedingly difficult to comprehend. The scrupulous meticulousness with which they executed their innumerable religious ceremonies, and observed the regulations which they had established regarding the veneration of the divine power or powers, and their dedication to religious magic, earned for them among the nations with whom they interacted the reputation of being at once the most devout and the most superstitious of mortals. That this reputation was, on the whole, thoroughly justified, is the objective this modest volume endeavors to demonstrate. Egyptian magic dates from the era when the pre-dynastic and prehistoric inhabitants of Egypt believed that the earth, and the underworld, and the air, and the sky were populated by innumerable entities, visible and invisible, which were deemed to be amicable or hostile to humanity according as the operations of nature, which they were presumed to govern, were advantageous or detrimental to him. In nature and attributes, these entities were considered by early humanity to closely resemble themselves and to possess all human passions and emotions and frailties and imperfections. And the primary objective of magic was to bestow upon man preeminence over such beings. The benevolence of the entities who were placable and amicable toward humanity might be secured by means of gifts and oblations, but the cessation of hostilities on the part of those that were implacable and antagonistic could only be achieved by wheedling and cajolery and adulation, or by employing an amulet or secret name or magical formula or figure or picture which possessed the efficacy to summon to the aid of the mortal who possessed it the power of a being that was mightier than the adversary who threatened to inflict harm upon him. The magic of the majority of early nations aimed at precipitating the transference of power from a supernatural entity to man, whereby he was enabled to achieve superhuman results and to become for a duration as formidable as the original possessor of that power. But the objective of Egyptian magic was to endow man with the means of coercing both amicable and hostile powers, nay, at a subsequent time, even God himself, to execute his desires, whether they were willing or not. The belief in magic, the term being employed in its most exalted sense, is more ancient in Egypt than the belief in God, and it is indisputable that an exceedingly large number of the Egyptian religious ceremonies, which were executed in subsequent eras as an integral component of a profoundly spiritual worship, had their genesis in superstitious customs which date from a period when God, under any appellation or in any manifestation, remained unconceived within the minds of the Egyptians. Indeed, it is probable that even the utilization of the sign which represents an X, and which stands as the hieroglyphic character both for God and God, indicates that this weapon and implement was employed in the execution of some ceremony connected with religious magic in prehistoric, or at any rate in pre-dynastic times, when it in some enigmatic manner symbolized the presence of a supreme power. But be this as it may, It is unequivocally certain that magic and religion developed and flourished side by side in Egypt throughout all epochs of her history, and that any investigation which we might undertake regarding the one necessarily includes an examination of the other. From the sacred texts of ancient Egypt we ascertain that the power possessed by a priest or individual who was adept in the knowledge and application of magic was believed to be virtually boundless. By articulating specific words or names of power in the proper manner and in the appropriate tone of voice, he could heal the afflicted, and cast out the malevolent spirits which caused pain and suffering in those who were diseased, and restore the deceased to life, and bestow upon the departed the power to transform the corruptible into an incorruptible vessel, wherein the soul might abide for all eternity. His incantations enabled human beings to assume diverse forms at will, and to project their souls into animals and other creatures. And in obedience to his commands, inanimate figures and pictures became living entities and things which hastened to execute his behests. The forces of nature acknowledged his might, and wind and rain, storm and tempest, river and sea, and disease and death wrought devastation and ruin upon his foes, and upon the adversaries of those who were provisioned with the knowledge of the words which he had wrested from the deities of heaven and earth and the underworld. Inanimate nature likewise obeyed such words of power, and even the cosmos itself came into existence through the utterance of a word by Thoth. By their means the earth could be cloven asunder, and the waters, forsaking their inherent nature, could be piled up in a mass, and even the sun's trajectory in the heavens could be halted by a single word. No deity or spirit or devil or fiend could withstand these words of power, and the Egyptians invoked their assistance in the most trivial as well as in the most momentous events of their existence. To him who was versed in the lore contained within the tomes of the double house of life, the future was as intimately known as the past, and neither time nor distance could constrain the operations of his power. The mysteries of life and death were laid bare before him, and he could draw aside the veil which concealed the secrets of fate and destiny from the comprehension of ordinary mortals. Now, if perspectives such as these concerning the magician's power were maintained by the educated populace of ancient Egypt, there is little to wonder at when we discover that beliefs and superstitions of the most debased character flourished with rank luxuriance among the peasantry and laboring classes of that nation, who failed to comprehend the symbolism of the elaborate ceremonies which were performed in the temples, and who were too unlettered to distinguish the spiritual conceptions which lay at their root to accommodate the religious necessities of such individuals. The magician, and in subsequent eras the priest, found it requisite to provide pageants and ceremonies which appealed primarily to the senses, and following their example, unscrupulous but cunning men exploited the ignorance of the general public and feigned a mastery of the supernatural, and laid claim to the possession of dominion over gods, and spirits, and demons. Such fraudulent knowledge and power they vended for monetary compensation, and for purposes of personal gain the so-called magician stood ready to facilitate any sordid transaction or nefarious scheme which his dupe desired to execute. This magic degenerated into sorcery, and demonology, and witchcraft, and those who trafficked in it were regarded as associates of the devil, and servants of the powers of darkness, and practitioners of the black art. In the white and black magic of the Egyptians, the majority of the magical practices known in the other countries of the world may be found. It is impossible as yet to articulate precisely to what extent the beliefs and religious systems of other nations were influenced by them, but there is no doubt that certain paradigms and religious ideas of numerous heathen and Christian sects may be traced directly to them. Many compelling proofs might be adduced in corroboration of this assertion, but the constraints of this volume will not permit of their being expounded here. Upon contemplating the elevated spiritual character inherent in the greater portion of the Egyptian religion, and bearing in mind its profound antiquity, it remains difficult to comprehend why the Egyptians so meticulously preserved within their texts and rites an abundance of material that bore the unmistakable imprint of crude and puerile superstition. Such elements must undoubtedly have been the legacy of their predynastic or prehistoric forebears, retained even throughout the epoch of their most profound intellectual enlightenment. Nevertheless, the indisputable fact remains that they maintained a resolute belief in a singular God who was omnipotent, eternal, and invisible, who forged the heavens, the earth, and all entities contained therein. They likewise believed in the resurrection of the body into a transfigured and glorified state, destined to endure for all eternity alongside the spirits and souls of the righteous. This everlasting existence was to be spent in a realm governed by a sovereign of divine providence, one who had dwelled upon the earth, suffered a brutal demise at the hands of his adversaries, risen from the dead, and ultimately ascended as the God and King of the world beyond the grave. Furthermore, despite holding these convictions and declaring them with an almost fervent intensity, they appear never to have emancipated themselves from a profound inclination toward amulets, talismans, magical appellations, and words of power. Indeed, they seemingly relied upon these arcane instruments for the salvation of their souls and bodies, both in life and in death, with a conviction comparable to the faith they reposed in the death and resurrection of Osiris. It is a matter of considerable astonishment that they perceived no incongruity in such an amalgamation of magic and religion. The prevailing disposition of the Egyptian mind regarding this matter is aptly elucidated by the subsequent facts. Affiliated with the service of Ra, the sun god, at Thebes were numerous fraternities of priests. Their obligations consisted as much in the transcription of sacred texts and the perpetuation of divine traditions as in attending to the deity during their designated seasons. Those members of these orders who inscribed the copies of the Book of the Dead manuscripts interred alongside kings, queens, and personages of royal or elevated standing, proclaimed with unequivocal certainty the power and omnipotence of Almighty God, whose manifest emblem to humanity was the sun, as well as his supreme sovereignty over all matters celestial and terrestrial. Reason would dictate that they genuinely believed their own proclamations, namely, that God possessed ample power to safeguard his emblem in the firmament. Yet, the priests of Thebes concurrently produced copies of treatises containing incantations to be recited at prescribed hours of the day and night. These texts provided explicit instructions for the execution of magical rites, the avowed objective of which was to prevent the mythical monster Apep from vanquishing the sun god. Furthermore, it is asserted with utmost gravity that if a fragment of papyrus bearing an illustration of the monster, alongside a waxen effigy of the same, is incinerated in a fire kindled from a specific variety of grass, and if the ordained words are chanted over them as they combust, the sun god shall be emancipated from Apep. Consequently, neither rain nor cloud nor mist shall possess the capacity to impede his light from descending upon the earth. Moreover, the rubric characterizes the execution of this ceremony as a highly meritorious act. E. Wallis Budge. London, August 28, 1899. Chapter 1. The Supremacy of Magical Words. Within the inaugural volume of this series, an endeavor was made to present the reader with an exposition of the concepts and convictions harbored by the ancient Egyptians concerning God, the pantheon, the judgment, the resurrection, and immortality. In essence, to delineate in brief the abundance of beauty, nobility, and sublimity inherent in their faith. The factual foundation of this exposition was derived entirely from indigenous religious texts. The most recent of these works dates back several millennia, while the earliest may be said to boast an antiquity of between 6,000 and 7,000 years. The excerpts cited in support of the deductions articulated therein were provided to afford the reader the opportunity to independently assess the general validity of the conclusions presented. Numerous scholars of Egyptian religion have largely overlooked the reality of its dualistic nature. On the one hand, it bears a striking resemblance in multiple respects to the Christian faith of the contemporary era. On the other, it parallels the doctrines of various sects that proliferated during the initial 3 or 4 centuries of our epoch, groups whose tenets might be described as an amalgamation of Christian and non-Christian elements. In its non-Christian dimension, it embodies an assemblage of concepts and superstitions characteristic of a savage or semi-savage state of existence. Such primitive notions retained a measurable grip upon the minds of the Egyptians long after they had progressed to a highly advanced stage of civilization. One might deem such concepts and beliefs to be both puerile and fallacious. However, there exists no justifiable cause to doubt their profound reality to those who adhered to them. Regardless of whether they were puerile, fallacious, or both, these superstitions undeniably permeated the religion of the Egyptian populace, wherein they took root and flourished. Indeed, a considerable portion of them were subsequently assimilated by the Egyptian converts to Christianity, the Copts. Allusions to these practices are ubiquitous within the finest classical literature of the ancient Egyptians. Furthermore, it is highly probable that from this source, they permeated the literary traditions of other preeminent nations of antiquity, ultimately disseminating into the nations of Europe by way of the Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and various other cultures. Within the ensuing pages, an endeavor shall be made to furnish the reader with the evidence concerning the magical facets of the Egyptian religion. Such material would have proven incongruous in the preceding volume, the primary objective of which was the elucidation of convictions possessing a more purely spiritual nature. However, mirroring the methodology employed in the treatise regarding Egyptian concepts of the future life, the data presented herein are extracted from papyri and an array of indigenous documents. Moreover, the cited excerpts are drawn from compositions that the Egyptians genuinely utilized in order to manifest magical outcomes. Egyptian magic fundamentally manifested in 2 distinct categories. The first encompassed practices utilized for legitimate purposes, conceived with the intention of bestowing benefit upon either the living or the deceased, while the second consisted of sorcery employed to advance nefarious plots and schemes, deliberately intended to inflict calamity upon those against whom it was directed. Within their religious texts and treatises, one observes how magic was relegated to the role of handmaiden to religion, frequently appearing in specific passages directly alongside the most exalted of spiritual conceptions. Assuredly, there can be no doubt that the paramount objective of these magical volumes and rites was to advantage those who had, by whatever means, acquired sufficient erudition to harness their power. Tragically, however, the Egyptians suffered the misfortune of being profoundly misunderstood by many of the foreigners who ventured into their domain. Consequently, erroneous and embellished conceptions of their religion were propagated among the neighboring nations. The magical rites conducted during their funerary proceedings were thus mischaracterized by the uninformed, dismissed either as the foolish acts of mere superstition or as the sinister machinations of the black arts. Yet, whereas the mystical practices of every other civilization in the ancient Orient were directed exclusively against the forces of darkness, devised to thwart malicious designs by invoking the assistance of benevolent entities, the Egyptians aspired to command their own deities to labor on their behalf, compelling the gods to manifest at their behest. Such extraordinary results were to be achieved through the articulation of specific words, which, to guarantee efficacy, had to be intoned with precise vocal resonance by a duly qualified practitioner. Furthermore, these words could be inscribed upon a tangible medium, such as papyrus, precious stones, and the like, and worn upon the person, allowing their potent effects to be transmitted across any conceivable distance. Given that nearly every man, woman, and child in Egypt who possessed the requisite means wore some variety of such a charm or talisman, it is scarcely surprising that the Egyptians were, from a remarkably early period, universally regarded as a nation of magicians and sorcerers. Hebrew and Greek and Roman authors referred to them as authorities in the occult sciences, and as the possessors of powers which could, dictated by circumstance, be wielded to bestow either benevolence or detriment upon mankind. From the Hebrews we derive, incidentally, it is true, substantial illumination regarding the capabilities of the Egyptian magician. Saint Stephen extols that the illustrious legislator Moses was erudite in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and declares that he was mighty in words and in deeds, and there exist numerous features in the life of this remarkable figure which demonstrate that he was intimately acquainted with a multitude of the practices of Egyptian magic. The phrase mighty in words presumably signifies that, akin to the goddess Isis, he possessed a commanding tongue and articulated the words of power which he knew with flawless pronunciation, and halted not in his speech, and was consummate both in issuing the command and in vocalizing the word. The transmutation of a serpent into what is apparently an inanimate, wooden staff, and the subsequent reversion of the staff back into a writhing snake, represent feats which have been executed in the East from the most remote antiquity, and the capacity to govern and direct the movements of such venomous reptiles was one of the arts of which the Egyptian was most profoundly proud, and in which he was most preeminently skilled, already in the era when the pyramids were under construction. But this was by no means the sole evidence which Moses provides that he was profoundly versed in the magic of the Egyptians, for, much like the sage Abianer and King Nectanebus, and all the myriad other magicians of Egypt from time immemorial, he and Aaron possessed a marvelous rod by means of which they orchestrated their wonders. At the behest of Moses, Aaron elevated his rod and smote the waters, and they became blood. He stretched it out over the waters, and frogs innumerable appeared. When the dust was smitten by the rod, it became lice, and so forth. Moses scattered ashes toward heaven, and it engendered boils and blains upon man and beast. He stretched out his rod, and there was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, exceedingly grievous, and the flax and the barley were smitten. He stretched out his rod, and the locusts came, and after them the darkness. Now Moses accomplished all these things, and brought about the demise of the firstborn among the Egyptians by the command of his God, and by means of the specific words which he instructed him to speak. But although we are informed by the Hebrew author that the Egyptian magicians could not replicate all the miracles of Moses, it is unequivocally certain that every Egyptian magician believed that he could execute feats equally marvelous by merely uttering the name of one of his gods, or through the words of power which he had learned to recite. And there are numerous instances on record of Egyptian magicians utterly annihilating their adversaries by the recital of a few words possessed of magical power and by the performance of some apparently simple ceremony. But one profound distinction must be established between the magic of Moses and that of the Egyptians among whom he resided. The former was wrought by the command of the God of the Hebrews, but the latter by the gods of Egypt at the behest of mortal man. Later on in the history of Moses's dealings with the Egyptians we find the account of how he stretched out his hand over the sea, And the Lord caused the sea to recede by a formidable east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel advanced into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a towering wall unto them on their right hand, and on their left. When the pursuing Egyptians had come between the two walls of water, by God's command Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its formidable strength, and the waters returned, and inundated the chariots, and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. But the mastery over the waters of the sea or river was claimed by the Egyptian magician long before the era of Moses, as we may observe from an intriguing narrative preserved within the Westcar papyrus. This document was inscribed in the early part of the 18th dynasty, circa BC 1550, but it is evident that the narratives contained therein date from the early empire, and are in fact as ancient as the Great Pyramid itself. The story is recounted to King Khufu by Baiuefere as an event which transpired during the reign of the king's father, and as a testament to the wondrous powers of magic which were possessed by the priest named Chachuemenk. It is recorded that on a certain day King Seneferu was in profoundly low spirits, and he appealed to the nobles of his royal household expecting that they would discover some means whereby his heart might be gladdened. But as they could do nothing to elevate the disposition of the king, he gave orders that the priest and scribe of sacred texts, Chachuemenk, should be brought into his presence immediately, and in accordance with the royal command he was at once brought. When he had arrived, Seneferu said to him, "My brother, I turned to the nobles of my royal household seeking for some means whereby I might uplift my heart, but they have discovered nothing for me." Then the priest made answer and advised the king to betake himself to the lake adjacent to the palace, and to embark upon a sail on it in a vessel which had been luxuriously furnished with provisions from the royal estate. "For," said he, "the heart of thy majesty will rejoice and be glad when thou sailiest about hither and thither, and dost gaze upon the beautiful thickets which are on the lake, and when thou sayest the picturesque banks thereof and the resplendent fields, then shall thy heart experience true happiness." He subsequently petitioned that the king would permit him to orchestrate the excursion, and asked his authorization to let him procure 20 ebony paddles exquisitely inlaid with gold, and also 20 young virgins possessing magnificent tresses of hair and lovely forms and shapely limbs, and 20 nets wherein these virgins might array themselves instead of in their customary garments. These virgins were appointed to row and serenade his majesty. To these proposals the king assented, and when all preparations were concluded he took his place in the vessel. While the young women were rowing him about hither and thither the king observed them, and his heart became unburdened from its cares. Now as one of the young women was rowing, she became inadvertently entangled in her own hair, and one of her ornaments which was crafted of fresh turquoise fell into the water and sank beneath the surface. She ceased to row, and not herself only, but all the other maidens ceased to row also. When the king perceived that the maidens had ceased from their labor, he said to them, "Will ye not row?" And they replied, "Our leader has ceased to row." Then turning to the maiden who had dropped her ornament overboard, he inquired of her why she was not rowing, whereupon she recounted to him what had transpired. Upon hearing this, the king pledged that he would retrieve the ornament for her. Then the sovereign commanded that Chachuemenk should appear before him at once, and as soon as the sage had been brought into his presence he said to him, "O Chachuemenk, my brother, I have acted according to thy counsel, and the heart of my majesty became profoundly glad when I observed how the maidens rowed. But now an ornament which is crafted of new turquoise and belongeth to one of the maidens who row hath fallen into the water, and she hath in consequence become silent, and hath ceased to row, and hath disrupted the rhythm of those in her company. I said to her, "Why dost thou not row?" And she replied, "An ornament of mine made of new turquoise hath fallen into the water." Then I said to her, "I will retrieve it for thee." Thereupon the priest and scribe of sacred texts Chachiamanc uttered certain words of power, and having thus caused one section of the water of the lake to fold upward upon the other, he discovered the ornament resting upon a potsherd, and he retrieved it and presented it to the maiden. Now the water was 12 cubits deep, but when Chachiamanc had elevated one section of the water atop the other, that combined expanse became 24 cubits in depth. The sorcerer once more intoned specific words of power, and the waters of the lake reverted to the state they had maintained before he had caused one portion to ascend upon the other. Subsequently, the sovereign orchestrated a grand banquet for his entire royal household, rewarding Chachiamanc with gifts of every conceivable variety. Such is the tale of the formidable abilities commanded by a magician during the era of King Khufu, or Cheops, who reigned at the dawn of the 4th dynasty, circa 3800 BC. The manuscript of this narrative currently in our possession predates the epoch in which Moses lived, and thus there exists no possibility that it represents a distorted iteration of the biblical miracle wherein the waters of the sea stood as walls, one upon the right hand and one upon the left. Conversely, Moses's miracle may well possess some historical or thematic connection to the feat performed by Chachiamanc. Among the Greeks and Romans, considerable reverence was maintained not only for the profound wisdom of the Egyptians, but equally for the prodigious capacities for invoking magic that they were reputed to possess. The Hellenic travelers who journeyed to Egypt returned to their native lands bearing abundant intelligence regarding its religion and civilization, and, although they misinterpreted numerous phenomena they witnessed and heard, certain of the most eminent thinkers among the Greeks regarded that nation not solely as the cradle of knowledge and the genesis of civilization and the arts, but also as the absolute fountainhead of what has subsequently been termed white magic, as well as the black arts. In certain respects, they magnified the abilities of the Egyptians. However, when these classical authors were thoroughly informed, they frequently attributed to them merely the exact magical erudition that the Egyptian sorcerers themselves purported to command. A compelling illustration of this phenomenon is provided within the second book of the Metamorphoses of Apuleius, wherein, as one may recall, the subsequent tale is recounted. The scholar Telephron arrived one day in Larissa, and as he roamed the city in a virtually penniless state, he observed an elderly man standing upon a substantial block of stone, issuing a proclamation to the effect that any individual willing to undertake the guardianship of a corpse would receive a handsome reward. When Telephron inquired whether the deceased were in the habit of absconding, the elder replied rather testily, explaining that the witches throughout Thessaly were accustomed to tearing morsels of flesh from the faces of the dead with their teeth to formulate magical incantations. Consequently, to forestall such desecration, corpses necessitated vigilant observation throughout the night. The young man proceeded to ask what his specific duties would entail should he accept the post, and he was informed that he must remain entirely wakeful for the duration of the night, gaze unblinkingly upon the deceased, look neither to the right hand nor to the left, and refrain from closing his eyes even to wink. This stringent vigilance was absolutely imperative because the witches possessed the supernatural ability to shed their skins and assume the guise of a bird, a dog, or a mouse. Moreover, their cunning was so profound that they could manifest as flies to cast a deep slumber upon the sentinel. If the watcher relaxed his attention and the body became mutilated by the witches, the torn flesh would have to be compensated for with equivalent portions from the watcher's own body. Telephron agreed to assume this perilous duty for the sum of 1,000 nummi. He was subsequently guided by the old man to a residence, and upon being escorted into the chamber housing the deceased, he encountered an individual inscribing notes upon tablets, meticulously documenting that the nose, eyes, ears, lips, and chin were entirely pristine and intact. Having been furnished with a lamp and a provision of oil, he commenced his vigil that evening. All proceeded without incident, notwithstanding his profound trepidation, until the dead of night, at which time a weasel slipped into the chamber and peered confidingly at the sentinel. However, he swiftly expelled the creature, which was undoubtedly a witch in disguise, from the room, only to succumb immediately thereafter to a profound slumber. In the early hours of the morning, he was abruptly awakened by the clarion call of soldiers' trumpets. Almost instantly, the widow of the deceased entered alongside 7 witnesses and commenced an inspection of the corpse to ascertain its integrity. Upon discovering that it had sustained no injury, she commanded her steward to disburse Telephron's fee, expressing such profound gratitude that she promised to welcome him as a permanent member of her household. In his endeavor to articulate his gratitude, however, he inadvertently employed a distinctly inauspicious turn of phrase. Immediately, the servants of the estate descended upon him, buffeting him severely, plucking his hair out by the roots, rending his garments, and ultimately casting him violently out of the residence. Shortly thereafter, while wandering the streets, he observed the funeral procession advancing through the forum. At that very moment, an elderly man approached the bier and, amidst fervent sobs and tears, accused the widow of poisoning his nephew so that she might seize his inheritance and wed her lover. Presently, the mob that had congregated clamored to set her domicile ablaze, and several individuals commenced stoning her, a violent display in which even the young boys enthusiastically participated. When she had vehemently repudiated the accusation and called upon the gods to stand as witnesses to her innocence, the old man cried out, "Let, then, divine providence decide the truth in answer to her denial. Behold, the famous prophet Zachlos the Egyptian dwelleth among us, and he hath promised me that for a considerable sum he will compel the soul of the deceased to return from the realm of death in the underworld, and to make it dwell within his body once again for a brief duration." With these words, he led forward a man arrayed in linen and wearing sandals crafted from palm leaves, who, akin to all Egyptian priests, bore a shaven head. Having kissed the priest's hands and embraced his legs, the elder implored him by the stars, by the deities of the underworld, by the sacred island of the Nile, and by the inundation, etc., to restore life to the corpse, if only for the briefest conceivable moment, so that the veracity of his accusation against the widow might be conclusively proven. Thus solemnly adjured, Zachlos touched the mouth and the breast of the deceased 3 times with a certain herb. Having then turned his face toward the east and offered a prayer, the lungs of the corpse began to draw breath, and his heart commenced to beat. Raising his head and shoulders, the dead man questioned why he had been summoned back to the realm of the living, and subsequently pleaded to be permitted to rest in profound peace. At this juncture, Zachlos addressed him, warning the revived man that he possessed the power, through his invocations, to summon fiends to torment him, and thus ordered him to reveal the precise circumstances of his demise. With a heavy groan, the corpse replied that the wife whom he had recently wed had given him poison to drink, and that he had perished as a direct consequence. The wife immediately contradicted her husband's damning testimony, and among the spectators gathered around, some adopted her defense while others championed his accusation. At length, the husband declared that he would unequivocally prove the veracity of his own words, Pointing toward Telephron, who had attempted to guard his remains, he informed the assembly that the witches, after executing numerous attempts to circumvent the young man's vigilance, had ultimately cast a profound sleep upon him. He further explained that the sorceresses then called upon the deceased by his own name, which happened to be Telephron, identically matching that of his sentinel. While the dead man was feebly endeavoring to obey their dark spells, his watcher rose up in an unconscious state and began to ambulate. Observing this, the witches breached the chamber through some imperceptible passage, and, having severed the nose and ears from the living watcher, they adroitly affixed waxen replicas of those appendages in their stead. Those who heard this astonishing revelation gazed fixedly at the young man, who immediately raised his hands and touched the aforementioned features, whereupon his nose detached directly into his palm, and his ears slipped through his fingers to fall upon the ground. The conclusion of this narrative need not concern our present inquiry, and so we proceed to observe that the specific act of touching the mouth, as performed by Zaklaus, is undeniably a constituent of the ceremony of opening the mouth which is so often referred to in religious texts, and was considered of extreme importance for the welfare of the dead, and that the capacity to resurrect the dead, which Apuleius attributes to the priest or magician, was genuinely claimed several millennia before Christ by the venerable sages of Egypt, as we may readily discern from the ensuing account preserved in the Westcar Papyrus. A son of King Khufu named Herutataf, who was renowned as a scholar and whose name is preserved within the Book of the Dead in connection with the discovery of specific chapters of that marvelous compilation, was one day conversing with his father, presumably regarding the magical powers possessed by the ancients. In response to a remark made by Khufu, he replied, "Up to the present, thou hast only heard reports concerning the things which the men of olden times knew, and man knoweth not whether they are true or not. But now I will cause thy majesty to see a sage in thine own time, and one who knoweth thee not." In reply to Khufu's inquiry, "Who is this man, O Herutataf?" the young man answered, "It is a certain man called Teta, who dwelleth in Tetzaneferu, and is 110 years old. To this very day he eateth 500 loaves of bread and the shoulder of an ox, and he drinketh 100 measures of ale. He knoweth how to fasten on again to its body a head that hath been severed. He knoweth how to make a lion follow him whilst his snare is trailing upon the ground, and he knoweth the number of the aptet of the sanctuary of Thoth." Now, Khufu had long sought out the aptet of the sanctuary of Thoth, as he was highly anxious to construct a similar one for his own horizon. Although it is currently impossible to determine precisely what the aptet was, it is abundantly clear that it was an object or instrument utilized in connection with some form of magic, and it is equally apparent that the king was as profoundly interested in this pursuit as his subjects. In response to his son's words, Khufu commanded him to go and bring the sage into his presence. Thus, the royal barge having been prepared, Herutataf set forth for the dwelling place of the wise man. After sailing up the river for some distance, he and his retinue arrived at Tetzaneferu. Once the vessels had been secured to the quay, the prince commenced the remainder of the journey, which proceeded overland, in a type of ebony litter borne by men using poles of Cessnichum wood inlaid with gold. Upon arriving at the abode of Teta, the litter was lowered to the ground, and the prince emerged to greet the sage. He found the old man reclining upon a basketwork bed or mattress that had been placed for him in the courtyard of his residence, whilst one servant massaged his head and another rubbed his feet. Following a suitable exchange of greetings and due reference to the sage's honorable condition, Herutataf informed him that he had journeyed from a great distance to deliver a message from his father, Khufu. The sage bade him a hearty welcome and prophesied that Khufu would greatly exalt the prince's rank. Their greetings concluded, Herutataf assisted Teta to rise, and the venerable man set out for the quay leaning upon the arm of the king's son. Upon arriving there, he requested that a boat be provided for the transport of his children and his books. 2 vessels were immediately prepared and fully manned with their complement of sailors. Teta then sailed down the Nile with Herutataf, whilst his family followed behind. In due course, the party arrived at Khufu's palace. Herutataf entered his father's presence and reported that he had brought the sage Teta before him. Khufu issued orders for the man to be brought to him post-haste. Having proceeded into the colonnade of the palace, the king had Teta led into his presence. Khufu inquired of him, "How is it, Teta, that I have never seen thee?" The sage replied, "O prince, he who is called cometh, and since thou hast called me, behold, here I am." Khufu then asked, "Is it true, according to what is reported, that thou knowest how to fasten on again to its body a head which hath been severed?" The sage answered, "Yea, verily, O my lord the prince, I do know how to do this thing." Khufu commanded, "Let a captive who is shut up in prison be brought to me, so that I may inflict his doom upon him." However, Teta answered, "Nay, my lord the king, let not this thing be performed upon a man, but rather upon some creature that belongeth to the sacred animals." Thereupon someone brought him a goose. Having severed its head, he laid the body of the bird upon the western side of the colonnade, and the head upon the eastern side. Teta then stood and uttered specific words of magical power, whereupon the body began to move, as did the head. With each movement, the 2 parts drew nearer to one another, until at length the head reassumed its proper place upon the bird, which straightway began to cackle. Following this, Teta had a Cathay bird brought to him, and upon it he performed the identical miracle he had wrought upon the goose. To demonstrate that he possessed comparable power over larger beasts, an ox was presented to him. After its head was struck off and fell to the ground, he pronounced his words of magical power, and the ox stood up and lived as before. The 2 preceding narratives from the Westcar Papyrus are sufficient to prove that as early as the 4th dynasty, the practice of magic was a recognized art among the Egyptians. Furthermore, everything gleaned from later texts indicates that it is well nigh impossible to conceive of a time in Egypt when this was not the case. The wisdom of the Egyptians, however, was twofold. That is to say, they possessed 2 distinct forms of knowledge that enabled them to interact with both the material and the spiritual worlds. The surrounding nations, conversely, conflated these 2 domains and subsequently misunderstood such matters entirely. One of the most ancient names for Egypt is Kampt or Kempt, a term signifying black or dusky. It was applied to the country on account of the dark hue of the mud that forms the land on either side of the Nile. The Christian Egyptians, or Copts, later transmitted this word under the form scheme to the Greeks, Romans, Syrians, and Arabs. From a very early period, the Egyptians were renowned for their metallurgical skill and their endeavors to transmute metals. According to Greek writers, they employed quicksilver in the processes by which they extracted gold and silver from native ore. These procedures yielded a black powder or substance that was believed to possess the most marvelous powers, containing within it the individual essences of the various metals. Indeed, their actual physical substances were thought to be incorporated therein. In a highly mystical manner, This black powder was identified with the body that the god Osiris was known to inhabit within the underworld. Magical qualities were attributed to both, and both were regarded as profound sources of life and power. Thus, parallel to the advancement of skill in the ordinary processes of metalworking, there arose in Egypt the belief that magical powers resided within fluxes and alloys. The art of manipulating metals, coupled with the knowledge of their chemical properties and magical potencies, came to be described by the name chemia, that is to say, the preparation of the black ore, which was regarded as the true transmutation of metals. To this term, the Arabs appended the article al, thereby producing the word alchemia, or alchemy, a term that shall forever perpetuate the reputation of the Egyptians as triumphant students of both white magic and the black arts. Yet, in addition to their prowess as craftsmen and artisans, the Egyptians were highly skilled in literary composition and the production of texts, particularly those concerning the ceremonies performed for the benefit of the deceased. Unfortunately, we have no definitive means of ascertaining what early contemporary peoples thought of these Egyptian funerary rites, but it appears certain that it was primarily through such practices that they acquired their enduring reputation as workers of miracles. Had any members of a nomadic desert tribe been permitted to witness the ceremonies performed when the monarchs for whom the pyramids were constructed were laid to rest, the tales they relayed to their kindred would undoubtedly have been received as incontrovertible proof that the Egyptians possessed the capacity to resurrect the dead, to animate statues, and to command the subjugation of their deities through the mere articulation of their names as words of power. Furthermore, the columns of hieroglyphs that frequently adorned the tomb walls, alongside the divine figures painted or sculpted upon stelae or sarcophagi, would have profoundly impressed the unlettered peoples, who consistently regarded the written word and its interpreters with immense reverence. The subsequent narrative, drawn from the historian Masudi, serves to illustrate the Arab perspective regarding the inscriptions and divine depictions housed within Egyptian temples. According to this account, following the drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, the surviving women and enslaved individuals grew fearful of impending assaults by the monarchs of Syria and the West. Amidst this crisis, they elevated a woman named Deluca to the throne, selecting her for her wisdom, prudence, and mastery of the magical arts. Deluca's initial decree was to encircle the entirety of Egypt with a formidable wall, defended by sentinels stationed at brief intervals, her objective being twofold: to protect her son, who harbored a fervent passion for the hunt, from the predations of wild beasts, and to secure Egypt against incursions by nomadic tribes. In addition to this, she positioned effigies of crocodiles and other fearsome animals around the perimeter of the enclosure. Throughout her 30-year reign, she proliferated temples and animal effigies across Egypt. Moreover, she crafted representations of men modeled after the inhabitants of the neighboring territories in Syria and the West, as well as the beasts upon which they rode. Within these sanctuaries, she amassed the myriad secrets of nature, harnessing the attractive and repulsive forces inherent in minerals, flora, and fauna. She executed her sorceries at precise moments during the revolution of the celestial bodies, timing her rituals to align with periods when they would be most receptive to a higher power. Consequently, should an army march from any region of Arabia or Syria with the intent to assault Egypt, the queen would compel the effigies of its soldiers and their mounts to vanish beneath the earth, and this exact fate instantaneously befell the living creatures they represented, regardless of their location on their journey, and the obliteration of the sculpted figures precipitated the absolute ruin of the hostile host. In essence, the colossal depictions of deities sculpted or painted upon the walls, along with their accompanying hieroglyphic inscriptions, were perceived by those unable to comprehend or decipher them as exclusively magical figures and formally designed to function as talismans. The historian Masudi chronicles an instance of magical prowess exhibited by a certain Jewish individual, demonstrating that Egyptian magical practices had proliferated eastward, finding a highly receptive environment among the Jewish communities residing in and around Babylon. This practitioner, a native of the village of Zurara in the Kufa district, devoted his time entirely to the execution of magic. Within the mosque at Kufa, and in the presence of Walid ibn Uqba, he conjured multiple apparitions and manifested a monarch of colossal stature, mounted upon a steed, who galloped throughout the courtyard of the mosque. He subsequently transformed himself into a camel and traversed a tightrope. He then caused the phantom of an ass to pass seamlessly through his own body, and finally, having slain a man and decapitated him, severing the head entirely from the torso, he passed his sword over the dismembered parts, whereupon they instantly united, and the victim was restored to life. This concluding feat strongly evokes the aforementioned account of the reattachment of a deceased goose's head to its body and the subsequent resurrection of the bird. It is now necessary to furnish a brief exposition of the primary instruments upon which the Egyptians relied for the practice of magic, that is to say, magical stones or amulets, enchanted figures, mystical illustrations and formulae, magical names, ritualistic ceremonies, etc., as well as those sections of the Book of the Dead that generally pertain to these subjects. Chapter 2. The efficacy of sacred amulets. The term amulet designates a specific classification of objects, ornaments, and articles of attire, crafted from a variety of substances, which were employed by the Egyptians and subsequently by other civilizations to safeguard the human body, whether living or deceased, against malignant influences and the assaults of both visible and imperceptible adversaries. The word amulet is derived from an Arabic root signifying to bear or to carry. Hence, an amulet is inherently an object that is borne or worn upon the person, and the appellation is broadly applied to any variety of talisman or ornament to which supernatural properties are attributed. While it remains ambiguous whether the amulet was initially conceived to protect the living or the deceased, it appears that its primordial purpose was to shield its possessor from ferocious beasts and venomous serpents. With the passage of time and the ensuing evolution of religious philosophies and convictions, novel amulets reflecting these burgeoning perspectives were contrived. And through a seamless cognitive transition among their wearers, the very objects deemed capable of preserving the living were soon adapted to protect the dead. Furthermore, because the preservation of the corruptible physical form, maintaining its members whole and unblemished, was of paramount importance to the vitality of the spiritual and incorruptible body believed to emerge from it, the corpse was transformed under the influence of these new doctrines into a veritable repository of amulets. Every individual limb and organ was entrusted to the specific guardianship of a dedicated amulet, and a multitude of objects believed to offer general defense against serpents, vermin, mildew, decay, and putrefaction were lavishly distributed within, upon, and around the remains, as well as interspersed among the bandages with which it was swathed. The precise epoch during which the Egyptians initiated the practice of adorning their dead with amulets remains indeterminate, just as it is equally impossible to ascertain the exact genesis of the belief in the efficacy of any specific amulet. It is evident, however, that particular amulets encapsulate beliefs and superstitions of such profound antiquity that even the ancient Egyptians themselves occasionally harbored doubts regarding their origins and underlying significance. Amulets may be broadly categorized into two typologies: those inscribed with magical formulae, and those bereft of such inscriptions. In primeval eras, incantations or prayers were vocalized over amulets that were worn by the living or bestowed upon the dead by priests or individuals designated by the community to execute religious rites. However, as not every individual possessed the means or authority to employ such intercessors, words of magical power and prayers were, at a comparatively early date, directly carved into the amulets themselves, which thus became. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.